to deliver an address not exceeding 7 minutes. Here.
Okay. Can you please confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. In that case, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. A couple of points of model before going on into a bunch of arguments. One, the way this probably works is we cross-reference a particular policy within an election plan or program to the socioeconomic and demographic situation of a particular person, e.g., Trump scraps Obamacare, we will calculate the harm of that to the individual person and reimburse them in that way. Secondly, we see this as an opt-out card from politics. Therefore, if people choose to engage in this option, they are banned from political activism. For example, if you are the owner or CEO of a company, if you choose to use this option for reimbursement, you are banned from donating money to political parties or influencing politics through lobbying. We say this is one or the other as to ensure that the system is not overburdened with financial influence. Let's move on to a very important principle frame which feeds into the principle we want to run. We feel that there is no objectively good political outcome from elections, be it ideologically, insofar as you have no epistemic access to which ideology is the correct ideology, and when choosing between moral preferences, the very choice of the metric is in and of itself a subjective moral decision, but also in terms of what the correct allocation of preferences is, given that a system of one person, one vote cannot account for the intensity of preferences, but also calculate the sum of the quantities. It means the system is necessarily skewed against creating the correct decision. Consequently, we do not care what the outcome will be or whether Trump wins insofar as they cannot prove that it's objectively the correct decision in the eyes of God. What we want to debate then about is the maximization of individual agency within the political system, because insofar as there is no objective truth, the only thing we can regress towards is a subjective definition of happiness, because every individual has the largest access to the full breadth of their experiences, desires, and wishes to be able to define that for themselves. Note in the status quo, you practically cannot influence the outcome of elections as a single voter. Even in the most swing states of the US, the difference in votes is like 10,000 or 20,000. So even if all of your family members vote, you are still not decisive in the election. This means that it creates a collective action problem in which you essentially as an individual have no power. It is therefore rational for us to create a backup plan for you in situations where you know that your influence is not the decisive one. This is important because of the principle of recourse towards the state. When the state is infinitely more powerful than you in a couple of regards. One, it controls your entire life through legislation, your welfare, your education, your healthcare, and so on and so forth. Secondly, it has coercive means to enforce its bidding, insofar as it can send the police and the military in to control your behavior if it disagrees with it. But thirdly, you can never escape the yoke of the state, right? You can move in between states, but you're always under the control of the state. This means that insofar as happiness and the achieving of happiness is related to your ability to achieve your goals, this is directly related to the material conditions of your existence, which you can only control insofar as you can control that which defines it through its legislation, which is the state. Which means that in order for you to ensure that you have a good life, or at least the best possible life, you need to have ability to operate within the boundaries of the state. Insofar as you cannot control the outcome of elections, but this policy ensures that we at least compensate you. This amount of money is proportional to the harm that will be done to you, which means that it allows for you to undertake planning for the next term of the elections, like 4 or 5 years. It enables you to keep up a business, if that's the proportionality of the harm, to pay for your healthcare, the essential basics you need for you to define your path in life, therefore your destiny. Through this, then, we maximize the agency of people through allowing them to have the means necessary to control their life in the way they want subjectively, which is the truest moral definition we can have, therefore the only morally satisfactory outcome in this debate. We already win it principally, note, because it's independent of practical outcomes. But let's move on to practical outcomes. We say this is also a self-moderating mechanism. Know that the people who are going to vote and not insure themselves against the win of a particular candidate are those who are relatively insured regardless of which option wins, right? Who are not going to incur a large amount of cost if one or the other option is triumphant in the election. This therefore likely means that the people who vote are moderate, center-right and center-left, who probably will not suffer a lot of harm regardless of what happens. The reason why this is important is because it also moderates policy, because it means that the people who vote do not have a preference for radical overhauls of the system, be it healthcare or education, but rather the continuation of the current system with some incremental tweaks on one side or the other. This is important because policy consistency is incredibly key to the survival of a system. Insofar as when we have radical changes of policy, this means there is a large sunk cost in debunking and destroying the underpinning of the policy that happened before, because it probably is underpinned by a different taxation policy, by different logic of welfare payments, and so on and so forth. There's a huge sunk cost in destroying the infrastructural underpinning of the previous policy and crafting another one. As administrations change, this sunk cost repeats over time, which means we never have a functional policy that has a time-tested system that has been incrementally adapted to the needs of the citizens, but rather a lot of time and capital is spent irreparably on shifting these policies around. On our side, we ensure that we have a consistent path-dependent system with incremental tweaks that are better adapted to reacting to the situation. But secondly, it also reduces polarization in the system insofar as people have lower ideological clashes in between them because the system has less people on the far right or far left voting. This therefore means that elections are more likely to revolve around policy rather than around ideological purity or other ways to get cheap political points that are not related to policy efficiency. Note that although we do claim that there is no morally correct outcome, this argument shows that we have a pragmatically more efficient system and a system that is more responsive to the individual needs of each citizen insofar as they're a unique moral actor that has equal right for the politicians to represent their needs and their demands in political debate. So we win this on the practical as well. Before I move on to my last practical point, I will take closing opposition.
Presumably, in the best case of this iteration, you get one cycle of moderates voting, which leads to moderate policy reform, which means that the insurance that people get paid off is basically null because of the incrementalism. Doesn't this incentivize increased cycles in the future of polarization once people find that the vote's more important and more impactful in their lives?
One, we say that moderate policies are not necessarily those that will incur low compensation depending on your socioeconomic and demographic status. But secondly, then, the best that you can prove if that's the case you're going to run is status quo, in which case we still win because we have a principal benefit over the status quo, even if nothing changes. Know that no change is not a win for opposition. Last argument, which is why this probably empowers underprivileged groups. In a situation where a lot of people are not going to vote, those who are underprivileged are likely to see a niche for them to finally influence the system. Know that you're most politically active at the point where relative deprivation decreases slightly. You've always been underfunded, underrepresented. Nobody has campaigned towards you. Finally, in the situation you see is something that has never happened before, the ability to influence an election. You're likely to want to utilize this opportunity insofar as you probably fear that it's going to go away. Also, community leaders and activists are probably riling you up to vote and framing this as a historical opportunity. This therefore means that you are more likely to take the vote than an individual white middle-class person and probably get more representation, but also more campaigning towards you insofar as politicians know that you are probably the decisive vote. This equalizes agency because everyone is a unique moral actor, and therefore if we can prove that this shows more representation towards people who had comparatively less of it, this equalizes the game within the political system because they are not the decisive vote. For all of those reasons, vote for.
Okay, I thank the speaker for that speech, and I now welcome up the leader of opposition. Here.
Can people hear me like this?
Yep.
Yeah? Is that a yeah? Oh. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're audible.
Oh, okay, great. Sorry, just putting out my paper for a second. I'll be starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. As we saw today, small margins matter in elections. And whereas the opening government says that means we don't know what people want, we say that if 30,000 people in Pennsylvania would have taken out insurance, that state might have gone in the other direction, leading to significantly more power for a person that doesn't represent the poor, ultimately robbing them of the agency that the opening government so desires. Our cases clashes directly with him. We're going to explain two things. First, why the representation of the poor will drastically decrease, and second, why this polarizes politics, further disenfranchising the poor. Why is this directly in clash with the principle that they've brought in this debate? They basically say that we care about agency in people to sort of maximize their preferences, and we're indifferent between what it is. We agree, but we think that we should care most about the agency and the preferences of the poor in this debate, because on them, the policies of the government, which they rely on, simply have the most impact. What we're going to explain is that what this policy does is it robs them of their agency to change that powerful tool that influences their material conditions, which they claim are important for freedom as well. I have three other points of rebuttal before I move into the case. First, on this reimbursement, I think it's generally unrealistically high and not going to compensate. If you really, for Obamacare, would give in order to compensate appropriately for how expensive care is, it would be millions of people to every person in the United States. We think it's likely, therefore, to be much lower because of the huge costs. But second, even if it was high, it's impossible to predict, for instance, will this person get sick? And that's true for a lot of particular policies, which you simply don't know the future, what's going to happen to people. Hence why we think they never can be appropriately addressed, especially when another powerful person started in power. Second, we think that they make a claim that the moderates will vote more. I think the opposite is true. If you are in the bottom, like in the middle of politics, and it could go slightly left or slightly to right, you're more likely to be indifferent between which option it's going to be because you're closer to your ideal utility point. Hence why moderate people are much more likely to take out the insurance because they at least get the money, but between the other two options, they're slightly indifferent. Hence why extreme people will vote more because they care so much about politics that no amount of money, even the big amounts from Obamacare, would compensate because they believe so strongly in that opinion. The third point they make about helping the poor, I think actually the opposite is true. They say, the poor people see that other people don't vote, so they have more influences. But if poor people see, like we will explain in our case, that other poor people don't vote, the opposite happens because lots of other poor people aren't voting as well. Hence why my individual vote is unlikely to change things because I don't have a coalition of poor voters, which creates the kind of path dependency in the opposite way because poor individuals are now then incentivized to also not vote for that particular reason. Moving into a case where I will further deal with them. So look, why will deter poor representation? It's very simple. We think poor individuals, under their policy, could have voted out politicians that pursue policies that harm them or don't help them, and now, for instance, will take out the insurance instead of incentivizing them to change them, and instead will take the money even though they had the chance to win the election. Why will they take the money even if they had a chance to win the election or significantly increase the margin, which would also help them in a drastic way? 4 reasons. 1, it's incredibly uncertain what is going to happen. The polls are close, and you don't know which one is likely to be true. But there could be an enormous amount of changes as well into the future in terms of the economy or what will happen, for instance, with the particular country or with that particular politician who you don't know very well. So it's very uncertain if your vote, what will actually happen with that. But the amount of money is extremely certain. That's why you have a big incentive to take it. Second of all, it is in your individual interest. Look, if everyone would vote out, for instance, the politician that pursues policies against the poor, that is obviously in the interest of all poor people and better than the amount of money that they will give them. But your individual interest is better served if you take the money. So you often think, enough other people will vote for it. I can simply take the money and have my cake and eat it in too, because I get both the money and the politician out. When everyone thinks that ultimately leads to a collective action problem in which politicians that will pursue policies against their interests are elected. Third of all, the amount of money is way more concrete. You don't know what the exact policies are going to be. It is an election relatively far away, and you can feel the money right now. There are particular things that you can do with it straight away. Hence, a much more concrete option is much more easier to visualize for people. Hence why they will take it even if a realistic path for change was on the table. And fourth of all, other campaigns will abuse this to scare voters. What if you lose out on the money? What if, for instance, it doesn't matter, and then you could have, for example, gotten all this money to go on a vacation with, for instance. Those particular scare tactics on social media by using that data to target voters in a hyper-specific way are likely to change people's opinions. Why does this matter? I first want to establish why this matters, even if you don't win the election. Because even if you increase the amount of poor people that vote, it drastically can change policy. Because it creates an incentive for politicians to cater to that group, because they see that they turn up at the election, that they're not taking out the insurance, and that it's a block that they can win in the future. And that's why it changes their incentive. But also, you get more bargaining power. If you increase your representation in the parliament or you win certain local seats, you can already pursue policy because your bargaining chip on a national level and on a local level has increased and massively improved their lives. But in some cases, we actually think you will win the election because, as we've seen, small margins matter. And hence why a large amount of people taking out this particular deal will lead to politicians being touted. This is by far the biggest impact in the debate. For these people, for instance, a subsidy or welfare or cheaper healthcare can drastically change lives. It could literally make the difference between life and death, to a severe struggle or having a day without unrest and terrible worry, because these people depend on those particular policies. Hence why we think this is the most important impact in the debate. I'm going to further explain why this further polarizes things in 2 particular ways. After the election happened, it is for 2 reasons. First, there is now much more legitimacy to disenfranchise the other side. Why? Because the other side has taken out the money. We can take away policies from them. We can not care about them because they got the enormous amount of money that the opening government promised them in the first place. Hence why it feels kind of fair. They have gotten their compensation, hence why we don't have to think about them. We don't think that the amount of compensation can level up to the amount of disenfranchisement that those guys will create on their side of the hands. Hence why it's a clear loss. Okay, second reason. This will create massive amounts of extra polarization for the following reason. If you know a politician what is easier? You could make the other side hate you so much that they will take out insurance instead of voting against your competitor. Now, they're obviously going to say, oh, no, the incentive is the opposite. You don't want people to take on insurance, but instead vote for you. But think about it. What is easier for Trump versus Democrats, to convince Democrats to join his side, or to hate him so much that they will simply take out insurance instead of voting for Biden? The second is way more plausible in an already heavily polarized world, where people, through misinformation and echo chambers, often are very hard to change their particular opinion, but instead it's much easier to convince them to hate the other side so much that you'd rather take out insurance and vote for someone else. And so this is the easier option for politicians. Why is that polarization problematic? I think it also just generally disenfranchises voters, because the policies picked do not represent the majority, defeating them on their metric, but also are way more problematic often for poor people, because they go to much more extreme ends in hurting them. After the election words, it leads to worse election outcomes for poor individuals that robs them of their agency. That's why I oppose.
Okay, great. I thank the speaker for that speech, and I now welcome up the Prime Minister. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's audible.
I'll take headphones. So. Okay. So I'm going to start real soon. I think that the opposition in this debate assumes that, first of all, poor people vote unanimously for one party or the other party, that one candidate is better for people, even though maybe some other people might vote him in, and that generally this is what we should prioritize in this debate. I think we will win on these grounds too, but I'm not sure that they've proven you, except for the idea that there are people who are less economically, how do you say, stable than other folks, that they should have more rights in a democratic system than the same folks who have the same citizenship as they have. But first of all, I think with the technical rebuttal, we will just pay for their insurance premium. I think that that solves the issue of who we don't know if they're going to get sick or not. And this is generally the tendency to which we're going to compensate. So if you lose something, you get something in return for this if the policy is as follows. And secondly, I don't think that, how do you say, when we talk about the poor folks generally, I want to first engage with this idea. You don't know whether you will win the election or not with your vote. I think this is crucial. But even with, if we assume good polling, and polling is shit right now, even in the country with the best democratic tradition of voting and whatever, and such small differences, there is no way you can gauge whether you're going to help someone win or help someone lose the election. In order for you to win the election, your vote needs to be crucial in your district, and your district needs to be crucial for the whole election. This means that the difference, I know, between in Pennsylvania is one vote, this was your vote, and Pennsylvania decided the national elections. Other than that, there is no meaningful individual agency for you to change the course of election. Other than that, voting is largely irrational and done on basis of other things, and not necessarily that you have a rational expectation that you're going to change the system. Even if you believe so, I've just proven that there's no way that you can know this, so this is still irrational. Secondly, I contest that people who are of low economic situation vote unanimously. I think there's a lot of people who voted for Trump who are poor currently in the Midwest, and I don't think that that you can put them in the same thing. Oh, they want to vote for Democrats because Democrats offer maybe a more beneficial welfare state. I contest that they have a lot of power today because of disenfranchisement that happens, because of tendency to be angry at politics and emotional with politics, because they have every right to be so, because they are not given the cozy solutions that the middle class has and the how do you say the candidates that represent them, because of a tendency to be apathetic, not vote or not to engage in elections insoever. I also contest the idea that just because the government can do a lot to you, and probably won't, because otherwise there would be no poverty and this would be already alleviated, you have more rights than other folks to which the government has, let's say, a lesser influence on life. But that's the potential influence, right? Without them proving that you can actually influence the outcomes of the election by just voting, that means that, how do you say, they have no impact on their side of the house. And this is where I want to go to into our case and reinforce it, because I think I'm more or less done with the text in this part. all mechanisms of checks and balances, the bills of rights that we have, limits on terms, all of this ensures limited political influence on an individual, right? So this protects you from the political process. It also gives you some rights in terms of engaging with the political process, but it also limits the, I don't know, the idea of how much an executive can influence their power to you, and so on and so on. Here's why this is mitigatory, right? Because the influence and the harms that are done to you are to some extent mitigated by the rules that we have and by the limitations of power. However, they are not compensated, which means that if the harms is 10, with these protections that exist right now, the harm can be lowered to 5, but you still lose 5 of utility if you lose the election. This is why on our side of the house, it's through being anti-political, and this ensures that you can be anti-political to the extent by refusing to accept an outcome that might happen, or refusing to live under the influence of an outcome that might happen. The only freedom from politics is actually achieved. And given that structurally, I think that a large part of opening opposition's case proves this, that politics is maybe screwing some people. They're not giving them a chance. They're not giving them a decent life and all of these things. The ultimate right, which every individual should then have, regardless of the outcome of the elections, is the idea that there's going to be some more agency in the political process. Because I don't care if 80% of poor people vote for Democrats and 20% vote for Republicans. If on their side of the house they have a bigger turnout and the 80% are good, the 20% are still very much screwed, right? On our side of the house, each and one of them can ensure for the outcome that they are going to lose their sort of utility. On the idea that there exists a collective action problem, that exists in the status quo, guys, right? I mean, there is, how do you say, there is more folks, there's more people in the United States than the poor folks. I guess who the government can fuck up more is the people who are, let's say, of less economic, how do you say, status. But this is actually ensuring that you are able to, how do you say, cope with this. Because right now the collective action problem is that you depend on other folks, right? You depend on other folks' turnouts, you depend on folks in other states or in other jurisdictions in the voting. So this is the collective action problem that you're facing in the status quo. But the problem is that even if they say that we make the collective action problem worse because people are just going to be inclined to take the choice that benefits them individually, we say that's a benefit compared to the status quo that they have to upheld in this debate, because you still have the status quo of collective action problem and depending on other folks and what they are going to do in this specific issue, but you have no way of ensuring that you are going to somehow be kept safe. I want to take closing opposition before I finish with 2 more points.
Sure. So I'm curious, in your world, what exactly is the difference between, for example, fighting for more welfare policies for the poor, or for that matter, on the flip side, why then do you stand for vote at all if you believe that they are all irrational?
Because I think that inherently voting is irrational. And what gives voting the ability to be rational is that you can hedge against the said irrationality, right? Because there's other people who are influencing your decision, and you as an individual, you cannot do anything about it. That means that folks are most likely to use this as a means of political activity are the folks who are disenfranchised, who have the most to use. But, in the end, this means, as Tine has already contested, and this hasn't been engaged with this, that you're going to have moderate folks who don't have to lose so much, who are going to be deciding elections. Closing opposition response to this is there's going to be cycles of radicalization. I think it is, in this new system, it is really expensive and dangerous for people to start going on the idea of emotional, influences on the electorate and to go into the radicalization part where they're going to influence their identity a lot. And why is that? Because in this sort of situation where you know that voters are going to act more rationally, they're going to hedge against the potential of the other person being elected. They're less likely to, just basis on the emotion and all of this, go and vote against the person, right? Because this is the only choice that they have in the status quo, and this is why radicalization is possible, because you get both turnout on the other side and the other side. I think we break this deadlock. This is why you won't have cycles of radicalization. Thank you.
Okay, I thank the speaker for that speech, and I welcome up the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're audible.
Awesome. Let me just put up my notes real quick. It was a bit of a hassle.
All right. Sorry about that. I'll grab my timer. All right, 3, 2, 1. Before I go into more extensive rebuttal against opening government, let me start with bashing their model. What they want to do is compensate individuals exactly for the harm that they incur. There are 3 responses I have to this model why I think that is unrealistic. The first one is you simply cannot do this. The policy that will be taken and the policy questions for which a government will stand are completely uncertain. The effects of those policy choices are completely uncertain, and the life that individuals are going to lead for the next 4 years are completely uncertain. So I think that model is a cop-out out of this debate. But even if you accept that model, I have 2 more responses to this. The first one of those other 2, so I guess my second response is that the harm that is incurred by those people from that person getting into government will likely increase during the time that that person is in government. Why? Because that person has more legitimacy and will increase the number of harms that are sort of put on these people during that time in government when he's there. The motion, I know, says you don't know who voted against you or insured against you, but you kind of know, right? You don't know the individuals, you don't know their identity, etc. But Trump knows that black people don't like him, right? Or you know which voter groups are against you or are afraid of you. You've seen the stuff on Facebook, online, etc. Why then do these people get a significantly worse time during your time as president or parliament or whatever? First of all, you have an incentive to screw these people over, right? Because these people aren't part of your voter base anyway. They're not part of the opponent's voter base anyway, and you can simply get money by, for example, either taxing them or saving money on education or something that's provided for them. And now you also have the legitimacy to do this because these people have been bought off in the first place. We think that is problematic because the harm will increase during those 4 years and not be the exact same. Third of all, you have second order impacts, not just first order impacts. The result is on the lives of people isn't just this election cycle and this government policy. First of all, you have the political importance of your group, of your ethnicity or something like that in the next elections, right? Seeing that these people are either voting a lot for certain people or not voting at all decides whether people are likely to design more policy for them and trying to activate them into their political base, right? That has large implications in the future. It is other implications are who gets appointed in other positions and what are their actions going to be during those 4 years and all the time after. It is the general political climate of your country and what happens in that. All those things change at the moment the vote gets different. So therefore, we don't think you can compensate people exactly for the harm that is put onto them. That is likely in the future to be significantly larger versus short-term gain that you can get now from the money that you're getting. That is the debate that we're having today, not some kind of fictional fairyland that opening government is trying to propose. Then, a few other points of rebuttal to the general case that opening government is bringing today. The first one is that there is no actual rational reason to want to vote, and therefore this is good for individuals. Here, opening government makes a crucial thinking mistake because they are right. On the individual level, as an individual voter, there is no incentive to vote. But this question is not, given that this system exists, should you as an individual voter take out insurance? The question is, should we implement this system? And therefore, we have to look at the aggregate level, right? And at the aggregate level, because all these different people have incentives not to vote, all the lives of those individuals are going to change because suddenly all those other people are changing it as well, and the government is going to be different, right? That is very important because that means the implications for you are going to be significantly more severe, even though initially for you as an individual, it is a dominant strategy not to vote anymore. We think that is bad for the future of your group, of your community, of your society. Second of all, they said you have a principled right to insure yourself. Note that they never explained why that insurance has to be in lieu of your ability to vote. If you want to give everyone in society insurance against what happens with the government, we're completely fine with that, right? We have a problem with taking away people's right to vote, especially at the moment. They are people that need money, right? Because those people are the ones that are not going to vote and are going to get screwed over. More and more are going to disappear more and more to the political background. Those large long-term effects are going to accumulate and they will get screwed over. Then they try to run the case, but not really, but a little bit, that you only get functional policy under their side of the house with only some small tweaks. First of all, note that they're saying that is better because you have massive costs, transaction costs, switching your policies. But people know this when they are voting in an election, right? And they can take this into account. But apparently, they still find it more preferable to change the political sort of leader and accept those transaction costs because they care more about that other thing. Then at that point, I don't see why that is a problem, because apparently people change their mind, they change their views on what they want on the future, and that is completely logical. Second of all, I'm just not sure why you're going to get more moderate and more stable futures. Fears, etc., change too. It is still volatile. Which people are going to share them? Which candidates are going to come up? What party the moderate voters or something are going to vote for? I'm not sure why that is so stable as they are claiming. Third of all, Floors explains to you why you actually want other voters not to vote for their candidate, but to vote against you, because that way you can actually guarantee that you are going to get in power, right? Because at the moment you take away votes from the other candidate because they're so afraid of you, that means you're more likely to win your position. Therefore, we think politics is going to be more divisive. You have an incentive to make people fear you or hate you, because then they're not going to vote for you. We think, therefore, it is likely to be more radical. Fourth of all, we think at the moment you have less people in society voting in general, many groups who are out of the democratic sort of system because they would more likely want to take the money. That means there is less democratic control on the actions that you take. That means you can do more crazy shit, take more risks, screw more people over. We don't think it's going to be the good policy that's going to survive. The last thing that they're saying is your vote is going to be bad anyway. We think so therefore it doesn't matter for an individual. We think that is super unnuanced. People's votes aren't perfect. They don't know everything, but they're pretty good. Especially at the moment you look at the aggregate level and all the noise gets compensated, you get a pretty clear picture of the preferences of a country. And we think that matters, because it might win you the majority, but even if it doesn't, it can win you House seats, it can win you political importance for the next elections. Panel, incredibly proud to oppose.
Okay, I thank the speaker for that speech, and I now welcome up the member of government to open up the back half of this debate here.
Just to check, is my mic fine? Am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Sorry, just setting on my timer. Sorry about that. Sorry. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. One point of extension from CG today, why you'll have way more moderate parties and policies, and why that's indeed so important. Notably, this takes it over opening government, because while they perhaps gave some message to why moderate policy might happen, they didn't explain why it's important, whether there's no absolute truth to feel. But secondly, it'll be a more concrete practical impact that will be exchanged and more important than their principal idea of agency, because indeed agency in status quo is not an a priori principle in the first place. You trade it off for consequential impacts all the time, because in the absence of good policy or marginally less harmful policy, individual agency of the poor and of people is already compromised. Crucially, this will also challenge OAT more directly, simply because, well, we'll show to you why in the vast majority of cases elections aren't actually quite close. The liberals don't actually win. In most cases, you don't have liberals in the first place, and how this will ensure that you don't have politicians towards the right as Trump in the first place. So let's begin. Why will you converge around like having moderate policies and moderate parties? I think there's a huge incentive to converge insofar as a huge sum of money has to be paid. Oh, tries to rebut this. They say, no, will it really be that large? I would just encourage them to read the Infoslide, which clearly says you'll compensate them for the degree of harm incurred insofar as policies like healthcare and so on can have large degrees of harm. Yes, it will per unit be very large. I think that has to get to that. I think OG set it up quite nicely. This crucially means that lots of people that you otherwise would just shrug off as perhaps people who are not significant enough to change the outcomes of an election, you can't shrug off anymore because like 20, 30,000, 50,000 people can now detrimentally screw your the wealth you have as a. This is crucial because obviously the less amount of government resources you have, all the problems amplify more. You're more likely to go into debt. You're less likely to spend on resources, all of which means you can't implement your policies as much, which affects directly the amount of voters vote for you in the next election cycle. This crucially takes down your weird idea that, oh no, you'll actually make them vote, make them take insurance against you rather than trying to converse. No, it's a huge sum of money. You'll ensure that you don't take someone off to the extent that they actually take insurance against you. Surely this won't be literally any random person, all people taking insurance against you. It'll be a reasonable sum, but I think lots of people, the vast majority, will still vote. Couple of reasons why. One, lots of people recognize the importance of voting insofar as they want one party to come in over the other. Secondly, simply trivially speaking, lots of people subscribe to the cult of personality or have been long-term parts of political parties, like people in the PPP or people in the PTI. They simply won't grow away even if there's a self-interest related to them, which means they will still largely vote, and indeed their leaders will still encourage them to vote for them as opposed to take out insurance. So sure, there'll be a reasonably large sum of people who will take out insurance, but it's not like it's going to be anyone. Lots of people, the majority, will still vote. Notice then, because I showed you why the sum of insurance is likely to be high, this means there's an incentive towards all parties to actually ensure, appears in the chat, I'll take you later, actually ensure that you have stuff like, moderate policies and things of that sort. What does this necessarily look like? This looks like ensuring that you will pick off people to the point of which they'd rather take insurance against you than vote for their own political party who they have leanings against. This looks like you reaching out to the most disenfranchised, to the people who you otherwise would have screwed the most, i.e. pre, post elections, all things of that sort. What does this look like and why is it important taking over OG on this particular metric? Firstly, you are likely to focus on common policies as opposed to policies that only affect the select few. I would like to know, sure, all policy cannot be common, but there are large things that do have common interest in society, stuff like better economic situation, stuff like more access to healthcare. But even I think that's only contested in the US, which is a pretty fucked up country. But I think even as opposed to that, even the developing world, noticeably, which is a large amount of debate, stuff like anti-corruption sentiments are really predominant in Pakistan. Pretty much all common people believe in it, which means that there are common policies that you can focus on. The comparative is you will only focus on, in their side of the house, people who actually give you votes and donations. Specifically, because you only need to focus on the 50% plus one, you don't need to give a rat's ass about anyone else. The example, this is the PMLN party in Pakistan, who only focus on the province of Punjab, screwed over everyone in Balochistan, literally all political parties in Pakistan do, screwed over people in Sindh. You can't do that anymore insofar as all of these people in Balochistan and Sindh can literally ask for insurance against you, which means that while you might not necessarily prioritize them, you have an incentive to have more common policies. This is truly a huge impact insofar as you get benefits economically or otherwise, or infrastructure at the very least, that was only restricted to a particular ethnicity, particular group. It now happens even more. The second thing I want to note is this much less antagonistic shit and much less hate speech or just calling out one particular ethnicity over the other. This might seem weird for people who are white countries and so on, but it largely happens in the South Asia, in the subcontinent, in Africa, all of these places where democracies are relatively weaker, so it's important. Crucially notice here, in status quo, you have an incentive to shit on the most vulnerable group, i.e. in Pakistan, you see literally all parties, and that's the point. It's there don't exist any meaningful left-wing party because the democracy is so shit. All parties shit on the Ahmadis and call them out in their particular campaign slogans, simply because not because they're completely small, simply because there exist racist tendencies, there exist sentiments against them. You often use how much you shit against the minority, like the Shias or the Ahmadis, as a metric to get more elections in status quo. All of this means that in their side, they have incentives to further hate speech or further screw over the minorities. On our side, you do not have those incentives as far as the minorities can actually have insurance against you, which I've explained why it'll be so important. There's a few impacts to this, but before that,
yeah, you are the only one who's getting compensated. All the people that still voted and were hopeful and now lost because you opted out of that election are getting screwed over without getting any compensation. How's that legitimate?
This presumes that in the absence of this policy, you would have one. I'm going to talk about in just a second, but a couple of hints here. Firstly, in lots of the developing world, you don't actually have people who are standing for the common man simply because there's weak democracies and there's not actually fully functioning a system. And lots of poor people don't vote, but they might show up to collect insurance. Secondly, right-wing people parties are dominating elections across the world. Maybe the US is a minute example, especially in the developing world, simply because there are a few structural reasons why they're always going to win. So you might as well bring them towards the center as we do on our side. One, insofar as they're more pro-corporation and stuff of that sort, they automatically get more lobbying power and more donations there. Secondly, insofar as they've historically been in power, especially in the developing world, they're likely to stay in power insofar as they manage to recruit money and embezzle money and engage in corruption practices and things of that sort. But thirdly, crucially speaking, they often tap into like the racist tendencies and the insular tendency of people. So like of Sunni majorities in Pakistan and things of that sort. Insofar as there usually is like a big ethnic majority and a small ethnic minority, this means that right-wing parties are always likely to win, like in the vast majority of cases. This means that while your impact might stand in the US, for example, I don't see why the impact stands across the board. This then wins simply because, well, you know, insofar as right-wing parties are going to win most of the time, maybe not in the US, maybe not even in the UK, although they are kind of now, when the vast majority of the developing world, which is the most important stakeholder in any debate, we crucially bring them towards the center, which means they focus on common policies, but which crucially they don't focus their rhetoric and they think on instilling hate speech against a particular minority, which inspires on-the-ground discrimination, which inspires on-the-ground violence and hate against Shias and Ahmadis, which indeed makes them feel even shittier. All of this means that if you're right-wing are like to win anyways, might as well bring them towards the center and recruit the huge practical benefits. So proud to provide.
Okay, I thank the speaker for that speech, and I now welcome up the member of opposition. Here.
Hello, am I audible? Lovely. Just a few seconds with my timer. Cool. Am I still audible? Just making sure before I jump in. Yep.
Yeah.
Lovely. I will start in 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. OG might be trivially true that many things in this world aren't things we can control. But just as the belief in self-determinism and self-will is important for us in making good decisions in our lives, we think at the worst case, the illusion of agency is key to believing in a democratic system and creating a functional society. That broadly brings me to two extensions in this speech. Firstly, how the belief in a democratic system normatively is key to shaping and solving a lot of the problems in the status quo that Gov talks about, and why you shatter and destroy that and create far more worse things, particularly in developing countries that CG wants to talk about. But secondly, and importantly, we will actually map out the counterfactor of how democracy improves and repairs. Because without this, OO does some harm analysis, but doesn't do a lot of positive contribution in terms of why, for instance, the poor who Gov fairly asserts are disadvantaged anyways get representation, or why things are particularly better on our side. Before that, I have 4 responses to CG's extension, which is basically, money insurance is expensive, therefore financial incentive to do good things. First response, it's contradictory, because on one hand, they assert that quite a lot of people would probably vote anyway to exercise their preferences, which means logically that the amount of sum that you dole out won't be as significant on the budget, such as to allow for governments to incentively change policy. But the second reason, this is extremely crucial, right? This doesn't trade off the net gain that politicians have to get into power. That's structurally far more short-term and far more important than some long-term thing that they cognitively can map their head around about losing a specific amount of budget that's uncertain anyway down the line. But I'm pretty sure if you look at things that are expensive in the short-term, things like literally going to war that countries always do to amp up nationalistic sentiment and get elected and to seem strong, I'm unclear why a long-term budgetary constraint is that important. But thirdly, structurally, there is also a time lag to this, right? Broadly, when these policies harm people, it probably takes certain cycles and probably would be phased after the current election anyway, which means that it's unclear why this specifically affects people so much. For instance, if you have a disease 10 years down the line and you claim based on the policy that was instituted back then, it's not the current government that's responsible anyway for doling out that insurance. Politicians can have their hands free. They can also blame this exact policy and blame and demonize the opposition for costing so much fiscal budget, which which means that they won't be put at a policy disadvantage anyway. I'm broadly so unclear as to why this is the tipping point for why politicians actually make policy. But even more importantly, right, and this is the last response to this, the premise of that argument is there'll be moderate politics. And I think I responded to this immediately from a POI to OG, which is to say, at most, if you have one cycle of moderate policies in your best case, which means that people broadly who ensure get no compensation and don't benefit from it, it broadly means every advantage that Gov does only is structurally hinged on one cycle, because after that, people are going to vote and going to be divisive anyway. It broadly recreates all the harms that we talk about anyway. I'm unclear why this wins the debate. First extension, therefore, why is the illusion of autonomy and control in democracy key in believing in the system? And this is very simple, right? To the extent that democracy, that we tell people through medium like education, through politicians' speeches, through things like learning about civic society, that our vote matters and we could be a tipping point structurally, what this does is it empowers people and makes people believe that the democratic process is the only means through which they should vent their disagreements, they should seek negotiation, and they should seek agreement. Now, Gov might say that this is trivially untrue given the way that democracies might be dysfunctional, but the first thing I want to point is we need an aggregate of how this world functions. For every America, there are broadly functional societies, socialist countries, systems, and democracies in Northern Europe, for instance, that are broadly healthy and well-functioning democracies. The more important thing here is this. It is that to the extent that Gov has to push for this policy, it literally delegitimizes the existence of democracy and de-vote as the only option that people have to change political preferences. That is to say, to the extent that you give people an alternative to expressing your opinion through the vote, and the policy justification for that quite often are the exact argument that OG asserts about how voting is meaningless, how you should not be enfranchised in the political system, how this ultimately can't change much. It necessarily disenfranchises and makes people lose faith and shatters the ability for democracy to function at all. Why is this extremely problematic on several levels? I think the first reason why this is problematic is because it largely skews the ability for countries and democracies to function well, because now people are unwilling to actively participate politically and actively put their preferences on the table. It means that, for instance, like policy decision making, the amount of raw data that you collect, the ability for you to implement good things is skewed because people simply lose hope and lose faith that government can do anything for them, would rather take the easy option now to ensure. But the second argument here, and this is also important, is that broadly this leads to the inability for politicians to see countries as a cohesive unit normatively. That is to say, to the extent that you see this group of people as always ensuring and people that would not be politically significant in your calculus, it means that you necessarily alienate them because you don't see them as people that you want to care about anymore because of the fact that they will ensure anyway. What this means is broadly, and what happened is, if CG is correct in saying that there are sort of tyranny of the majority to a certain extent, I'll explain later why this is unlikely to happen on our side, it becomes far worse because now that tyranny gets entrenched and perpetuated through the fact that the minority will always choose to ensure rather than try to push for changes in policy or try to get political representation as well. But lastly, and this is extremely crucial in developing countries as well, to the extent that CG talks about this, right? The alternative, even in countries like the US, but also extremely poorly in developing countries that often have existing ethnic tensions and ethnic strives and have arbitrarily drawn borders to dispute resolution through democracy, is violence and destruction of society. If you look at how the dissolution of democracy in the US has already led to people going up to arms and complaining of electoral fraud, the literal alternative in places that CG talks about is civil war and people not opting to resolve things on orderly elections and inheritance of things like voting in the ballot box, so they think that this is meaningless and they would rather ensure anyway. What this literally leads to is humongous impacts beyond the policy level stuff that O talks about. Literally social unrest, economies not functioning, people losing jobs and dying, being unable to access any agency that OG talks about. I'll take OG. Yes, go for it.
Given that even in countries like Germany, vast swathes of people do not vote, your impacts are marginal. In that situation, why is it an illegitimate political preference to be protected from politics if your metric is literally an expression of preferences?
Perfect. The reason why we think that broadly this short-term expression of preference is illegitimate is because it significantly harms the long-term outlook of that person to the extent that society can't function and people literally can't express any preference whatsoever, as I explained earlier. So yes, people might have a choice to do certain things. The reason why, for instance, the state makes you do education, have seatbelt laws, is because they want to preserve your choices in the future because those matter and you compromise that as well. Why is the alternative better on our side? It's very simple. To the extent that people believe in democracy, and that's the key premise here. People who see erosions in democracy have an incentive to fix that through the aggregation of preferences. And this is key because I think it's correct for OO to point out broadly that small numbers matter in elections, and in particular in tight parliaments and with things like, for instance, like coalition bonding, small minority votes have the key decision swaying power in the political process. That's how you avoid the tyranny of the majority, because literally when your only option is to vote, it literally empowers each and every person, regardless of their background, to be politically important, and empowers people to aggregate your preferences towards the center, because you need these votes to win over other people as well through policy differentiation. That's how you get, for instance, the squad in the US Senate right now, which leads to better democracy. I'm very proud to stand in closing.
Okay, great. I thank the speaker for that speech, and I now welcome up the government whip to close out the gov bench. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, let me just put my timer on. And also, let me just adjust my papers a little bit. Here and there. Right, all right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm unsure if CO believes that a large number of people will take this insurance option or a large number of people will not. Because presumably their ideas about like social discourse collapsing, about the inability to ever get any kind of political gradual change is contingent upon the idea that lots of people will choose this sort of policy and then be subsequently alienated from the political process even more than they already are. Which means then again, because it is contingent on so many people taking this option, does that not support Essen's extension, where he argued that once politicians see that they are in danger, that their future policies are going to be in danger because of the fact that lots of people are going to stake a claim onto the budget that they have to work with, why will then not those parties that end up winning try to cater to those people who then potentially will be taking this insurance, right? Secondly, I think it's unfair to assume that parties care or like politicians care about the short term. I think that's untrue, because parties want to be able to win re-election consistently to the point that they can be entrenched within the political system, so that they can like lay their groundwork there solidly, so that they can continue to win elections and just like compound on each effort that they engage in, which means that they necessarily have like technocrats and advisors and like PhD advisors who will tell them that if you do XYZ thing right now, this will have subsequent consequences for your re-election campaign 4 years later, 8 years later, 12 years later. This is particularly important in most countries where political parties want to be important, right? I don't think just because just because you argue that Trump might be short-sighted doesn't mean that the vast majority of politicians, especially in like weaker democracies that again are the dominant number of majorities in the dominant number of democracies in the world, are right. So they want to necessarily be entrenched, which means again they're much more likely to cater to whether or not the economic policy that they're proposing is something that's going to benefit a large number of people. Because even if in the first election they have a negative policy that people, even then some people don't like even if let's say in one election the insurance option doesn't hang over them like a Damocles sword, it's likely to do so in the second election or in the third, the ones where they're probably going to try and continue the same policies that they did, which then are going to increasingly have less appeal to the people because of the fact that those policies haven't necessarily solved their problems, right? Secondly, again, and I have a question to opening opposition here as well. If in your characterization, poor people are rational, or like people in general are rational enough to be willing, or for example, that opposition parties are viable alternatives to like entrenched politics or like entrenched demagogues who are very bad for politics, especially in like developing countries where Essen told you that necessarily there's like an entrenched system of parties and then just like a very weak opposition that actually tries to care about people but is never elected. If this opposition is viable and if poor people are rational enough to see that this opposition is viable, then they are not going to necessarily take that insurance scheme, right? Again, this is operating on the sort of characterization that we're always talking about. But what exactly was the extension that Essen brought in? Why was it the most important thing, right? One, I think like the argument wasn't necessarily contended by CO when we argued that right-wing parties in the status quo tend to dominate, right? Right-wing parties are just generally parties that are like don't care very much about the people or the policies that run. I think like that's the vast majority of circumstances in this world. Like developing countries with weak democracies, even like the United States and United Kingdom to some degree, are suffering from their democratic like standing, right? Which means that these are likely to be elected, and the way that they are elected is by trying to exclude certain communities, right? So when their policies, for example, are going to exclude people who need the most amount of healthcare, or they're going to exclude people who are racial minorities simply because of the fact that they can then rile up or like use xenophobic or like racial tendencies or like racial ideas from the majority to try and like rally up those particular kind of votes, right? The reason they're able to do this, and before that, I'll take O's point.
Sure. What we explained to you is that actually at the moment sort of the government isn't representative. That has very long-term sort of spin-off effects. Why then don't you think that people's individual short-term incentive is worth more than the long-term incentives of the group that they represent and exist?
Well, I think like on a principle level, if there is a large body politic that necessarily feels disenfranchised from the political system, I think like on a principle level, and this is to some degree opening government's characterization, like you should be willing to give them the option of opting out of politics or like opting out of needing to support someone whom they just genuinely believe they don't want to support or believe they just don't want to like necessarily cater to those policies, right? But the point here is that even if let's say the way that necessarily works is the incentive model that we're talking about, right? So the only incentives then that you can give to parties that are right wing or parties that don't necessarily want to exclude certain communities is by arguing that this is going to be a financial burden on you that you need to then cater to. I think like opposition bench both argued that this gives demagogues and entrenched politicians a lot more legitimacy to like shit on the opposition or like shit on voters. One, in weaker democracies, this is a problem that is largely symmetric simply because of the fact that, for example, people often look to their, like the entrenched party or the demagogue looks at their opposition voters and says that these voters are ideologically subservient to the opposition party, or in some extreme cases, like in my country, that these people are like anti-state or they just generally don't want the benefit of the populace, right? We just don't think that this policy adds to a significant amount of like gives them a significant amount of more ammo to be able to to be able to necessarily act against like ideologically or like spread propaganda against their politicians. What the incentive, once again, the incentive that this does create for them is a fear that this is going to be a burden on their budget, or that simply for a fact that they'll have to concede, right? I think like most of them don't want their image to suffer, but their image will suffer in a world where they necessarily need to provide compensation to people, where then their opposition can say, hey, look, you are such a bad leader that people will rather like take money, they'll rather step out of the political system and rather than just vote for you. Everything, in fact, that gives the opposition a lot more ammo in any case, right? But again, going back to why extension is important, right? So again, in the status quo, like there's a trend of right-wing populism, there's a trend to increasing global capitalism, like corporations are stronger than they've ever been before, which means they lobby governments to enact certain policies. Neoliberal policies in developing countries are very common because the IMF has been implementing its programs for years. The problem here is that these parties have no incentive to cater to these people because of things like geographical distance. So Ehsan gave you the example of in Pakistan, where if a party like gives a shit about one province, they are likely to win the entire federation or national election. If in the electoral college, the Republicans give a shit about certain states and certain constituencies because the proportionality ends them winning the debate and even winning the match, like winning the election, even if they don't win the popular vote. In our model, you are unable to do that simply because you are now fearful of the consequences that that can have of your image, of the policies that you implement, of the fact that people are now potentially, at least there is a potential fear of people choosing the insurance option. Vote for side, CG.
Okay, I thank the speaker for that speech, and I now welcome up the opposition whip to close out this round of debate. Here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, cool. I want to start off by being very clear. CG doesn't have an extension. Their extension rests on a faulty mechanism that suggests that individuals, like politicians, are really afraid of having to pay compensation because it detracts from all the amazing economic policies that they want to pass in developing countries like Pakistan and India. Here are some responses that we think are just trivially true. One, insuring against that party doesn't actually stop them from coming to power, which therefore suggests that to the extent to which political office grants you things like patronage networks and personal benefit, there's no reason why they're particularly afraid of vast swaths of individuals insuring against them as long as they actually get to power. Two, they don't actually respond to any of Joshua's arguments about the incentives of governments that don't really give a shit about having to spend money. One, because of time lag. Two, just because like it puts them in power anyway. Like nations go to war, it's a multi-trillion-dollar business, they still do it. Three, presumably, if they are so discriminatory, they already expend a significant amount of money, like oppressing these areas. I'm going to assume separatist conflict in Aceh, for instance, is really expensive for you to deal with. That's not really an argument. But lastly, I want to argue that if whatever they say is true, and these people are already being discriminated, the counterfactual, as Joshua tells you, is one in which you're able to vilify these individuals. But I'm going to take it one step further and explain that given that to be the case, and given that the mechanism that you're using is the vote that these people have, it's just more incentive for them to push for things like non-voter, non-citizenship laws, like what we've just seen happen in India recently, where 4 million Muslims would give like not given the right to vote. Because now literally it also saves you money as well. There's just no reason why in such a horrible context as one that the CG paints, the government is suddenly going to become benevolent enough to have the long-term foresight of having to save money so that they can implement fantastic regulations. I just don't understand how those outcomes come about. What exactly did we present to you in this debate that we thought was important? We argued that the primary criteria in which individuals should care about in a democracy is the concept of norms. We agree to some extent with the OG, but we also think that this debate needs to note something that's, again, trivially true, but something that we've all been arguing on, which is that we want democracy as a method of expressing our preferences, and we want democracy to be the method through which we choose our governments. Presumably, this is because, to some extent, we just can't think of a better system that enables the representation of a pluralistic community and enables some measure of fairness. Given that to be the case, how then do we deal with the arguments on the OG? OG argues a few things. The first thing they argue is a very strange and unnuanced argument that there is no agency in voting and that it's ultimately irrational. We think we've responded to this quite well when we argued that this notion of irrationality, to the extent to which the notion of collectivization in a democracy means that your vote must have the equivalent like voice of everyone else. So yes, it might be irrational that you don't know the outcome, but ultimately the choice itself is an exercise of agency that on a collective basis enables this form of government to happen in the first place. Their side literally just argues against democracy, in which case this particular motion in terms of principles is just inherently contradictory to whatever they want to stand for. Number two, let's talk about radicalization. They told us that in terms of radicalization, this is going to make things less radical because you get the people from the far out away because now they want like they I don't know like they argue that like now only people in the center will really be voting. You don't get the people outside because they want money, etc. All argues against this through the platform of the politician, i.e. they become more radical because they want people to insure against them, and that's how they're able to capture more votes. We argue to you this on the notion of the voters themselves, i.e. the people who are actually voting. The problem is the debate presumes that politics happens on a scale of left to right. That's not true. Politics actually happens on granular levels for various identity groups that may have specific positions that don't align perfectly with any one particular party, but they choose to express those preferences, one, through the vote, which we agree doesn't necessarily express those intensity of preferences, but because they have those votes, are able to engage in conversation and dialogue that enables them to use their position as voting members and communities to negotiate with the people in democracies to create those incremental changes that OG cares about. So given that to be the case, then the illusion of agency is ultimately important. Why is that the case? We argued our counterfactual that the undergirding notion of democracy that we need to care about is the notion that individuals recognize the other side as being a legitimate representative of parliament, even if they don't personally agree with what those stances are, but still recognizing that these people care about forwarding the interests of the country. The reason why this is important is because democratic institutions are necessarily fragile and are only held together by the norms and the conception that people have about democracy. The tolerance and forbearance that they are willing to practice because they recognize that the democratic vote is not an all or nothing, but rather something that shows the preferences of individuals that are on the ground. But crucially, this requires individuals to believe at heart that democracy is working for them. What is the unique difference between this particular policy and everything else that exists currently? Before I move on to explain this, I'll take OG.
The belief that the individual vote is your only way to have recourse towards the system is specifically the reason why people feel powerless and distrust the system today. Our policy, if anything, creates the awareness that the state is aware that the system may harm you and is willing to compensate you for it. That probably increases trust in the system, which is your metric.
Yeah, so it's perfect. I'm just about to move into this and explain why this specific shift in that narrative is so particularly harmful. So presumably, the difference between this and any other policy that we've had so far is that even if we acknowledge that democracy is broken, what we don't do is not make people lose faith in democracy altogether. I think Joshua demonstrates certain positive trends to which we are able to achieve this. I'll build about this in just a little bit. But I think crucially, the difference between this specific policy is that the notion that you insure against a candidate coming in is the first acknowledgement of the system that the other side is reprehensible, will destroy you, and will never represent your interests, and that these people cannot be seen as legitimate heads of state. That is actually what you're doing when you insure against damages to yourself when a political party that's legitimate, like is seen to be a potential legitimate representation of your state, comes into power. But also, given that governance as a whole deals with necessary trade-offs, the notion of insuring yourself against harm means that you don't actually accept that government has any ability to make trade-offs in your welfare with regards to the common good of society. We think that breaks democracy thoroughly. But I think that Joshua demonstrates to you that we've already seen civil society recognize that democracy is somewhat damaged. The crucial difference is they believe that democracy can be reformed, which is why they work within civil society in terms of agitating the collectivization of these granular identity groups that don't feel represented, to push for things like more members of more female or progressive members in the Senate, for example, or in Congress, in order to show that their voice can work towards reforming the system bit by bit. This also works crucially in CG's arguments on the developing countries, where we often believe that the articulation of these political and ethnic identities needs to find space in parliament, and the only way that that can happen is with people check into the system as opposed to check out of it through insurance. We're very happy to oppose.
Okay, excellent. Thanks so much, everyone. Yeah, this is a closed round of adjudication, so yeah, feel free to just go do whatever you want to do for the rest of the evening. And yeah, you will find out the results eventually, but not too soon. Tomorrow morning after the break. Okay, cool. Best of luck all.